Microphone, please. We do have a little bit of impedance on the President's microphone, President additional. So that it's not there. So could you speak again? Okay, good. Well, let's keep an eye on that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, it's nice on, but I don't want it on. It is on. I can hear myself. You can only put it on when I get on stage.
Okay, so let me put that up for you. So when it's going on stage, please make sure that it's put up. So put it up. I'm going to crave your indulgence this morning just before we get started. For those of you who are way in the back, I'm going to ask that you fill some of the empty spaces up front. It's good to see everybody here this afternoon. Just a few announcements before we begin. Kindly check your mobile phones and ensure that they're either on mute or that they're turned off. Also, if you do have any reminders in the form of alarms on your phones or your iPads or your computers, please also make sure that those are turned off also. We're going to be starting in just about 4 minutes, enough time for you to get your coffee if you haven't already, and then it'll be all systems go. You do have the opportunity to receive translation services. There are headsets on each of the chairs. We will be accepting questions during this session, and you'll be able to submit your questions via Slido. So if you haven't done that already, please know that that opportunity does exist. Again, we'll be starting in about 4 minutes. Thank you very much for coming bright and early. Good morning. Chrissy Rabia. Did you recognize it? Please keep. Yeah. Good afternoon, distinguished guests, members of the diplomatic corps, leaders of business and finance, and friends of Africa and the global community. Good afternoon. My name is Victor Oladokun. It truly is a privilege and an honor to welcome you to this 2024 Kofi Annan Eminent Speakers Lecture Series organized by the African Development Bank Group and the African Development Institute, and coming to you live from Abidjan, Côte, as well as connection with the country of Ireland, as well as over 200 members, or actually participants, who are joining us online at the moment, with more expected. Well, a few years ago, the president of the African Development Bank Group, Dr. Akinwumi Adesina, named this distinguished forum in honor of one of the most eminent sons of Africa, the late Kofi Annan, the former Secretary General of the United Nations, who passionately believed that today's challenges require global solidarity. So as we're gathered here today, we actually do so to recognize and to remember the legacy of an extraordinary global leader and ambassador whose vision, compassion, and unwavering dedication to peace and to justice continue to resonate far beyond his time. He passionately believed that humanity's challenges demanded humanity's solidarity. Kofi Annan was not just a leader, he was also a beacon and a voice that transcended borders. And he would often say that you're never too young to lead and never too old to learn. So these timeless words are a call to action for each and every one of us gathered here today. Among many other things, and I think for everyone who had an encounter with Mr. Annan, there are many things that he said and many things that he stood for that, again, we can take to heart. But I'd like to leave us with these thoughts before we get our program going, that he was an architect of hope, a champion of equity, and a bearer of compassion. These three things distinguished him above everything else. So in that spirit, and inspired by his enduring words, permit me to thank you this afternoon for joining us here in Abidjan, and to the more than 200 people who are online, with others joining even as we speak, for what promises to be a very robust, engaging, and inspirational Kofi Annan Eminent Speakers lecture series this afternoon. Now, today's gathering is just more than a gathering of intellectual minds. It's a reminder of what's possible when vision, action, and commitment come together for the purpose of building a better future and a better world. So, we're graced together with a lineup of exceptional leaders who carry forward in different ways Mr. Annan's ideals, and whose body of work exemplifies the transformative leadership that we all aspire to. This afternoon, joining us from Dublin is His Excellency Michael Daniel Higgins, President of the Republic of Ireland, a statesman celebrated for lifelong dedication to social justice, sustainability, and global equity. He is a poet president whose words and actions inspire not only Ireland, but also the world. We're also joined by Dr. Akinwumi Adesina, President of the African Development Bank, a man who has championed Africa's economic transformation with unmatched zeal, working tirelessly to bring prosperity and dignity to millions of Africans, and who has consistently, over a very brilliant career, worked passionately to leverage every one of his positions, his networks, and partnerships to make a tangible difference in the lives of Africans. We're also joined by Her Excellency, Madame Epus Nkumari Yvette Koloko Asene, the Ambassador of the Republic of Cameroon to Côte d'Ivoire. With us also are several representatives of the diplomatic community. We thank you for joining us. We're also joined by the Executive Director representing Côte d'Ivoire on the board of the African Development Bank, Mr. Adama Kone, who I gather at the last minute has had to join us online. We're also joined by Mrs. Mette Knudsen, the Executive Director from Denmark, representing the constituency of Denmark, Finland, Norway, Sweden, India, and last but certainly not least, the Republic of Ireland on the board of the African Development Bank. With us also is the Vice President and the Chief Economist at the African Development Bank, Dr. Kevin Chika Urama, a visionary in sustainable economics who has dedicated his career to crafting inclusive and innovative solutions to Africa's development. Well, on that note, I'm going to ask that we give a very, very warm welcome this afternoon to each and every one of our VIPs, and everybody is a VIP, and to our speakers who have joined us this morning. Let's just give each one of us ourselves a warm welcome. And on that note, I'm going to ask Professor Kevin Arama to come to the platform and provide us with a few brief introductory remarks. And congratulations to you and your team for putting this excellent forum together.
Of Ireland, Dr. Akinwumi Adesina, President of the African Development Bank Group, Your Excellencies, Governors of the African Development Bank Group, Your Excellencies, Ambassadors and members of the Diplomatic Corps, Executive Directors, Senior Management and staff of the African Development Bank Group, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It is my deep pleasure to make this introductory remark at this 2024 Kofi Annan Eminent Speakers Lecture today. Since its inception in 2006, the Eminent Speakers Lecture Series has provided unique but critical platforms for generation, dissemination, and brokering of knowledge that are critical and essential for driving sustainable development and inclusive growth in Africa. The Eminent Speakers Lecture Series have become a forum for cutting-edge insights on key lessons learned in the process of development and the key visions for development in Africa, as well as key practices in Africa and elsewhere on how to drive development in key sectors. In this regard, the lecture series has hosted distinguished speakers, including prominent figures from politics, the academia, business, civil society, discussing a wide array of subjects, such as the economics of development in Africa, infrastructure development, finance, regional integration, human development, empowerment, gender equity, food security, climate change, and many other themes. These themes have helped shape the operations of the African Development Bank Group, the policies in African countries, and ideas about how to drive development going forward. Mr. President of the African Development Bank Group, we are exceedingly pleased today that His Excellency Michael Daniel Higgins, President of Ireland, has graciously accepted your invitation to share his deep thoughts and insights and perspectives on how to do development, especially on this key critical topic today. We have the privilege of hearing from a speaker who, as the moderator has described for us, shapes development dialogue everywhere, not only in Ireland. The topic at hand today is not only timely, but also crucial, as we find ourselves at the midpoint towards achieving sustainable development in Africa. Today's discussion will remind us that we must continue to innovate, collaborate, and push boundaries to find solutions that uplift our continent and empower future generations. I look forward to an inciting session that will encourage us to do more to drive inclusive growth and sustainable development on the continent. I thank you for your attention.
I want to say a very big thank you, Professor Rama, for those uplifting words, very short, very concise. And I do want to offer, again, apologies to President Higgins. Instead of referring to him correctly, as President of Ireland. I got carried away and referred to him as the President of the Republic of Ireland. It actually is the President of Ireland. Well, that being said, it is now my honor to invite a leader whose passion for Africa's transformation really is unparalleled. And that isn't a cliche, it is a fact. Through his work, Dr. Akinwumi Adesina has consistently questioned the status quo. He has been impatient with the pace of change. He has galvanized regional and global leaders, and he has resolutely refused to believe nor accept the prevailing narrative about Africa. Instead, single-handedly, many times, he has redefined the prevailing, not only narrative, but also Africa's agenda. He's done this at the African Development Bank over the last 9 years through the High Five strategy that has pretty much driven all that the bank has been engaged in the development space during this period. He has also changed the optics about agriculture as a sector of the past, but rather as a source of prosperity, jobs, and dignity for millions. It is for this reason, among many others, that he is fondly referred to as Africa's optimist-in-chief. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, kindly give a warm welcome to the President of the African Development Bank, Dr. Akinwumi Adesina, as he comes to the platform.
Thank you very much, Victor. Our eminent speaker today, Your Excellency, Michael Higgins, President of Ireland, Your Excellencies, Honorable Ministers, Governors of the African Development Bank Group, Your Excellencies, Ambassadors, Heads of International Missions, Executive Directors of the African Development Bank Group, and several of you are here today. Thanks for coming. Senior management and staff of the African Development Bank Group, and all our guests that are joining us online around the world, members of the press, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the 2024 Kofi A. Annan Eminent Speakers Lecture. This high-level lecture series is a key highlight of the African Development Bank Group. Through this platform, we honor the memory of a great man, the late former United Nations Secretary General, Kofi A. Annan. It is also an occasion to acquire new gems of wisdom and to rededicate ourselves to equitable development of our world. I have fond memories of my great mentor, late Kofi Annan. He was an astute and an exceptional leader. He led by example, an admirable man whose wit, wise counsel, and charming personality radiated to all those around him all around the world. His incredible leadership, depth of understanding of international issues, ranging from the place of multilateralism in fostering development to ending conflicts, with humaneness and compassion in tackling conflict and challenges, and supporting African smallholder farmers to anchor the continent's food security, remains an unending inspiration for millions of people around the world. It transcends time. As Kofi Annan once said, smallholder farmers are the ones who put food on our tables. They are the ones who care for our land and our water resources. In the end, they will be the ones to propel the economic growth and development of Africa in the 21st century. Of course, I couldn't agree more. I haven't worked with him as his vice president when I was vice president for Alliance for Green Revolution in Africa. Mr. Kofi A. Annan was also a very good friend of His Excellency President Michael Higgins and his wife, and of course, of the people of Ireland. It is all this in mind that I am delighted to welcome His Excellency Michael Dennett Higgins, the President of Ireland, as our eminent speaker for the 2024 Kofi Annan Eminent Speakers Lecture Series at the African Development Bank Group. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I also take this opportunity to congratulate President Higgins for being awarded the FAO Agricola Medal of the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization. Let's give it up to him for that. Now, President Higgins was recognized for his contribution and commitment to the welfare of all people, attaining universal food security and the pursuit of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Dr. Ku Dungyu, the Director General of the FAO, said the following while giving him this medal, and I quote, "It is the highest recognition the FAO gives to a head of state who has committed his life, his experience, his achievements, his influence, and his political will and courage to better global agricultural food systems for a better future with an active rather than a passive approach. He has questioned global agricultural policies. He continues asking hard questions about our current farming models and the necessary revisions to the use of subsidies with deep thinking and passion. This prestigious medal is conferred upon international figures who have undertaken outstanding efforts in advancing the cause of global food security, poverty alleviation, and nutrition. President Higgins is the very first Irish recipient of this medal. And given that our lecture focuses on achieving food security through globalization from below, we indeed chose a global icon to speak with us today. By accepting our invitation, President Higgins has yet again reaffirmed his commitment to Africa's development and offered us a unique opportunity to gain from his extensive experience in addressing global challenges. I recall the inspiring words of President Higgins at the Dakar II Summit on food sovereignty and resilience in January of last year, where you came with your very charming and beautiful and extremely kind wife, Mrs. Higgins, where you highlighted the critical challenges and emphasized Ireland's role as Africa's trusted partner in development. Your Excellency, Mr. President, you ended your speech that day with these golden and evergreen words, which I will read back to you. Let's make this century Africa's century, one which will see the continent become free from hunger, a shared continent in a global family, one based on the firm foundations of respect for each nation's own institutions, traditions, experiences, and wisdoms, founded on a recognition of the solidarity that binds us together as humans and an acknowledgement of the responsibility we share for our vulnerable planet and the fundamental dignity of all those who dwell on it. These unforgettable words, as relevant and timely as they are today, as when you first spoke them, strongly influenced the choice of our topic for your lecture today. Indeed, today's lecture is significant. It's a significant occasion, marking President Higgins' continued direct association with us and on matters touching on food security in less than 2 years. His strong support and partnership, despite his eminently demanding schedules, exemplify his great commitment to the African Development Bank Group, and I say thank you very much, Mr. President. Ireland officially joined the African Development Bank Group as its 81st shareholder on April 24, 2020. Prior to this formal partnership, Ireland recognized the bank's vital role in advancing Africa's development goals. Global Ireland, Ireland's strategy for Africa to 2025, prioritizes active engagement with the African Development Bank and other international financial institutions to drive sustainable and inclusive growth across the continent. Ireland's pledge of 32 million euros to the 16th replenishment of the African Development Fund and 6 million euros contribution to the Climate Adaptation African Climate Change Fund and the backing up of our climate action window is a testament to your unwavering commitment to our partnership. And furthermore, in 2021, Ireland contributed $150,000 to support Sudan's arrears clearance. The African Development Bank, Your Excellency, Mr. President, is a reliable and trusted partner, and Ireland is a committed supporter of Africa. Together, we can achieve the vision of the Africa we want by harnessing our joint efforts. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, now on a more personal level, President Higgins is a great friend of Africa. He loves Africa. He started working in Africa 50 years ago. He travels to Kenya, Tanzania, Lesotho. In 1974 and 1975, Mr. President, I was just 14 years old, 15 years old at that time. His family has been working in Africa, and they love Africa. His darling wife, Our Excellency Mrs. Sabina Mary Higgins, the First Lady of Ireland, actually helped to set up a health clinic in Mekele in Tigray, Ethiopia, some 28 years ago. I think we should give it up to Our Excellency. Their son is living and working in Nairobi, Kenya, and her brother is also a missionary in Africa. You may not believe it, but President Higgins is 83 years old. Now, he told me today when we spoke ahead of this lecture on a phone call, he said to me, "You are a youngster." But then he was so generous to go on to say, "But you are incredibly brilliant, and you are doing such great work." Well, thank you, Mr. President, for those kind words. I just wish that I will be incredibly as smart as you when I'm also 83 years old. President Higgins is incredibly sharp, you will find out, insightful. He has written extensively on sociology and anthropology, and in his words, my thinking is influenced by my training in anthropology. Well, today you will hear a lot from him from that perspective. Now, one last thing I need to say before I turn it over to the President is that he and I share something that's very important. He went to the University of Indiana University in Indiana. And I went to Purdue University, the great Purdue University, which is just one of the competitors with Indiana University. And I was reminding His Excellency, the President, that Big Ten basketball was also a big thing. And Indiana University will come to Mackey Arena at Purdue University, and we will play very tough basketball games. And in one of those games, there was Bobby Knight, who was the basketball coach of Indiana University. And of course, I'm sorry, Mr. President, we defeated you in that basketball game. And Bobby Knight took the chair and he flung it right into the middle of the Mackey Arena. Well, today, Mr. President, we are not in Mackey Arena. We are the African Development Bank. And Indiana University and Purdue University are not playing a basketball game. It's just you and I, two great alumni from Indiana University and Purdue University, going to have a very friendly fireside chat together. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, you will agree with me that President Higgins is best placed luminary to guide us through today's lecture titled, Achieving Food Security Through Globalization from Below, Issues for Structural Transformation, Inclusive Economy, and Sustainable Development in Africa. With his matchless experience, scholarly acumen, and practical knowledge on food security, and fresh from his global award, President Michael Higgins, we are delighted to have you speak with us today. Please join me, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, in welcoming His Excellency, President Higgins. Mr. President, the stage and lectures are yours. Thank you very much for coming.
Distinguished guests, and there are many, dear friends, members of the Diplomatic Corps, directors of the African Development Bank. There are so many distinguished representatives with us this afternoon. And I just want to say how honored I am to be with you all, and indeed for the invitation from President Adesina and the African Development Bank to give the 2024 Kofi Annan Eminent Speakers Lecture. It is a pleasure to share a space of discussion on sustainable development in Africa with the distinguished speakers we have just heard, Professor Oraman and indeed Dr. Adesina May I take this opportunity too to thank Dr. Asina for his kind remarks and for the meetings which we had previously in Dublin and Dhaka, which led to such positive discussions. And indeed may I compliment the bank on the recognition it has received for effectiveness in governance and, even more importantly, for transparency. And I am very pleased that Ireland is a contributor and a participant in the bank's work. In providing an opportunity to set out new ideas, agendas, and sustainable solutions for international cooperation and diplomacy, with a focus in particular on those issues that Secretary General Kofi Annan prioritized during his term as 7th Secretary General of the United Nations from 1997 to 2006. Issues that include peacemaking, peace building, and the strengthening of the international multilateral system. The Kofi Annan lectures help us recall Secretary General Annan's role in championing rules-based cooperation and the vital role of multilateralism. Today, a revived and invigorated multilateralism is called for more than ever if we are to respond with a sense of global responsibility to our present circumstances of multiple interlocking global crises, political, social, economic, and most importantly, ecological. This global context has produced what I believe is an existential moment affecting the future of humanity. In attempting to address issues of structural transformation, inclusive economy, and sustainable development in Africa today, I would like to provide, as part of my contribution to the series, a reflection on the topic of food security and global hunger. I believe that we must start anew in addressing food security, and this will involve redefining what is meant by development. I believe that there are some basic issues that cannot be ignored any longer. Issues, for example, relating to gender, land ownership, commodity choices, the external purchase of African land, and most fundamentally, though difficult to achieve, the need to redefine development itself in terms of sufficiency as a concept sensitive to contemporary conditions in such a way as is inclusive of the best aspirations for life, enabling for the fullest participation in life, and indeed in government. All of this achieved with ethics and bearing responsibility always for future generations in mind. We must earn the trust of people in diverse circumstances. In achieving this, we are challenged, however, by the fact that our delivery and commitments already made on sustainable development and climate change have been so much less than what was committed. Empirical research also tells us of how we are living through a pervasive and deepening inequality that scars our world. Never have so many had so little, and so much without responsibility. Are such circumstances ones to which we continue to be indifferent? Policymakers usually invoke a sustaining scholarship as source of their proposals. Standing behind policy formulation, there always lies dominant assumptions as to the theoretical connection between economy, society, and ecology. For example, modernization theory's long hegemony in academic curricula and in policy reflected the influence of the seminal, for so long uncontested, Princeton studies by authors such as Gabriel Almond and Sidney Verba, Samuel Huntington, Lucian Pye, David McClelland, and so many others. It was of such a character. Moving from early polarities of modern and traditional society, contrasted as to their features, such studies sought to construct a continuum stretching from tradition to modernity, listing features associated with traditional society that were perceived as inhibiting an inevitable journey to modernity, a journey and a destination associated with advanced achievements. That neoliberal capitalism was the inevitable and desired outcome for all people, with an unstated foundational assumption of such work. Rejecting the assumptions and outcomes of these studies, building on a different set of assumptions constituted, for example, a necessary starting point for the work that was needed in seeking to establish the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. The slow progress on the Sustainable Development Goals reflects too, I believe, the obduracy of the assumptions that form the paradigm that has produced our interacting crises. We are wrestling with the consequences of our globalization from above, led by the powerful, largely without transparency, and certainly without consideration as to social justice or ecological consequences, and because of its embedded nature in bureaucratic structures and the academy, for many, it is difficult to let go. Building on this, and as a response, it is my strong belief that a new inclusive globalization from below can achieve a new, invigorated, inclusive policy of provision and fulfillment, one that will include food sufficiency. Such policies and practices, given lead by those on the ground, and which, if accompanied by the delivery of universal basic services, will enhance democracy, improve participation, and be a source of leadership needed to create a sustainable shared future. The model I suggest is a model of sufficiency, services that meets needs universally, and beyond that, participation in a fair international trade, and that is respectful of diverse cultures, indigenous or imposed, and that are there in the history of Africa, but have not been given sufficient recognition. It is my belief that in Africa and elsewhere in the heavily populated world, policies must reflect a new beginning in theoretical and policy terms as to how we define concepts such as development and indeed globalization. We are at a significant moment in African history. Africa is the world's youngest and fastest growing continent. Today, 40% of all Africans are under 15 years. That percentage is set to rise by the end of the century, when Africa could have over 4.2 billion inhabitants, 40% of the predicted global population. Our redefinition of development or globalization must take account of such demographic projections, which should be seen both as a challenge and as an opportunity. It represents not just a continental challenge, but a global one, an opportunity to do things differently, with new purpose in so many parts of our world. The Africa of the future, the Africa of the young, can I suggest, constitute an arrow for the new thinking we need globally, rather than being a target for exploitation or simply as a new pool of consumers. Existing conditions in Africa are a cause for concern. Africa has some 475 million people living in poverty, which is about 1/3 of the continent's population, and shockingly, about 50 million more than in 2019. This is part of a global crisis. The recent global report on food crisis highlights that dangerous levels of acute hunger affected a staggering 282 million people across the world last year, up from 193 million in 2021. The 6th year in a row that food insecurity has worsened. More than 1 billion people in Africa struggle to afford a healthy diet, while 20% of the population is undernourished. An estimated 868 million people experienced moderate to severe food insecurity in Africa in 2022, with over 1/3 of those facing severe food insecurity. In responding to the challenge of providing sustainable lives for such populations, we must now move past previous reactive emergency humanitarian responses and undertake the tasks of tackling the underlying structural causes of hunger. What Africans will achieve in tackling its challenges with new economic models that are inclusive will also constitute a gift, I believe, of a new, better economics for all of humanity. Responding to our present interacting crises will require an entirely different model to that which came from modernization theory, one that usually portrayed an uncritical version of development as a single hegemonic model, one ending in an industrialization and urbanization that was responsive to market conditions, towards which the world was assumed to be structured and to evolve. I speak from my own personal experience at the receiving end of the modernization model at Indiana University. I was one of those graduate students who went from my own country, Ireland, to learn about its supposed backwardness and the cultural and human impediments to economic growth and development through the culturally ethnocentric, linear, and reductionist prism that was modernization theory. Responding to global hunger must be seen, I believe, above all as a response to human needs that have a historical and cultural context that cannot be ignored. In our present circumstances, including Africa, decisions will have to be made, for instance, as to what form of agriculture should prevail over the coming decades, and what form of agricultural practice can best align with the Sustainable Development Goals. Most important of all, who will participate in agricultural production? And it is a contentious and important point. Who will be left with ownership of the land of Africa? While food security is a human right embodied in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948 and the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights in 1966, there remain contesting approaches on how it is to be defined. Professor Glendenning is one of the eminent scholars who has been at the forefront in the debate on the future of agriculture and food security. Arguing for the use of the term universal food security over the more commonly used global food security, Professor Glendenning has defined universal food security as a world where every person enjoys a healthy diet derived from sustainable food systems, thus establishing an aspiration to reach every person on earth. In my proposals for a globalization from below, I go further and suggest that food security is best seen as an essential part of universal basic services, and in that way can best make a key contribution, I believe, to the delivery of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and Agenda 2030. A fundamental issue that arises from the current circulating proposals as to future agricultural production, including in Africa, is the issue of intensification. The different proposals are not neutral in terms of their impact on the Sustainable Development Goals. For example, proposals that suggest extensions into existing unused lands have implications that cannot be ignored for existing patterns of land use, communal, ancestral, and familial. Indeed, some of the proposals on offer require deforestation. Professor Howard Stein is among the contemporary scholars who have noted how African land commons are rapidly shrinking, with effects that will reverberate far into the future. with rogue actors grabbing customary land and corrupt elites exploiting weak land governance, the result is a land alienation, which, when taken together with the evolutionary trajectory towards the promotion of private individualized property rights as a necessary element of development, so-called, results in what has been referred to as the drama of the grabbed commons. Carlos Lopez is another scholar who has argued so well for so many years now that recognizing the critical importance of structural transformation for African countries in a manner that will allow inclusive and sustainable development is best enshrined in internationally agreed as well as regional development agendas. Fundamentally, there are two competing models of food security vying for adoption. One based on industrial agriculture and repositioning in global supply chains. The other, stressing the agency of smallholders, is focused on the achievement of the United Nations 2030 agenda. The second, I believe, can best deal with the consequences of climate change, is focused on breaking dependency, and by being people-led has a resonance that enables and enhances democracy. Such a model, based on a globalization from below, recognizes the interconnected nature of our global crisis, is also best connected, I believe, to our international obligations as agreed through the Sustainable Development Goals, and in its practice will make a significant contribution to participation and citizenship. Following a path of globalization from below offers not only the best prospects for sustainability, the breaking of dependency, and the achievement of a food security model in which Africans can participate, which has African agency, it would also be a significant and necessary contribution to global economics, and is necessarily a better fit with ecology and the principle of inclusion. It is an approach that is already paying dividends in instances where it has been utilized in Asia and South America. It is paramount that any model of food security and suggestions for changes in practices must deal with local realities and will always benefit from utilizing evidence from below. The Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, fact-finding with rural people, now almost 70 years old, and used in response to the Asian food crisis of the 1950s, while remaining a touchstone piece of research, it also offers a powerful example of how a tool of fact-gathering made available to rural people can have real and empowering results. While fact-finding with rural people was a tool designed to achieve better results in terms of produce, its use, however, sparked a powerful stimulus to economic literacy and participation as a result. That report and the social survey contained therein showed how instruments previously used in scholarship for a colonizing purpose in the past, such as anthropology and social inquiry, could be employed in a contemporary times to be a source for better policy, economic literacy, and would facilitate participation. May I suggest that what I would describe as the great giving back takes place, by which I mean that all of those tools of investigation and analysis used in previous centuries for, among other purposes, colonizing purposes, can, by building on such work as that of the FAO and by being put into new hands, can be used in an emancipatory way to redefine development in a manner which will include the achievement of food security. With, for example, the tools of anthropology thus used by Africans themselves to discover, address, and examine real experiences on the ground. They may enable a critique of the impact of initiatives being advocated or introduced in the name of assisting them. Utilizing such tools can help to empower Africans by their acquisition of the information necessary to be active rather than passive in the tasks of building their own future. By using such tools, they will be enabled to make a critique of proposals from the state and non-state institutions. Such experience will constitute a powerful driver for democratic participation and community-based leadership. It could lead, inter alia, to a necessary recovered discussion on the role of the state in making and proposing initiatives and the consequences of balance or imbalance between state and private interests. The state's role is crucial. The agricultural sector in many parts of Africa was liberalized during the 1980s with disappointing results. As Howard Stein has written, liberalization did little to create a robust and prosperous agricultural sector. Rejecting state-initiated models was an ideological position developed by international agencies such as the World Bank. Professor Stein and others have repeatedly advocated an alternative strategy, one that is aimed at reincorporating state-led policies to generate a sustainable agricultural sector. I find their proposals, which are sourced in empirically based research, to be both convincing and socially just in their valuing of inclusivity. The purpose of the new anthropology, from an African perspective, can also help inform us as to how the consequences of climate change are being experienced, how interventions are succeeding or not succeeding, which strategies of intervention facilitate citizen involvement, inclusion, acknowledge rights of women and children, how science and technology skills are best transferred. Such practice will fit well with the project of contributing to the undoing of and compensation for loss and damage. To deliver ethical food systems, recognizing the links between food insecurity, global poverty, debt, and climate change, requires a new model of food production and distribution, one that can employ the tools of science and technology in an equitable manner and for the benefit of humankind, as opposed to profit maximization for the few. However, the most urgent inhibiting factor facing so many African countries is the now unmanageable burden of debt service. The international community must recognize that there is an urgent, severe debt service crisis or liquidity crisis facing many countries. It is a problem that will, according to the International Monetary Fund, continue to worsen, and it has to be given priority if anything else is to be achieved. Debt is crippling so many African countries who are now facing the worst debt crisis in history. In many countries, spending on health and education is being cut, with nearly half of budgets being used to pay creditors. According to a recent report issued by Debt Relief International for Norwegian Church Aid, more than 100 countries are struggling to service their debts, resulting in deferral of urgently required investment in health, education, social protection, and response to climate change. Africa is likely to pay $163 billion in 2024 alone in debt service, up from a figure of $61 billion in 2010. And Africa is not alone in this circumstance. Debt services are absorbing 41.5% of budget revenues, 41.6% of spending, and 8.4% of GDP on average across 144 developing countries. What an appalling statistic it is, dear friends, that debt service exceeds social spending by 2/3 in Africa and low-income countries. As a result of the debt crisis, children are starving, AIDS victims are dying, the planet is burning, extreme poverty is rising, human rights are being abused, and thousands of species are disappearing. We must not forget that the sources of the external sovereign debt crisis and economic challenges facing so many African countries are largely attributable to surviving features of the colonial structure of the economy, features which make them vulnerable to even minor shocks. How policy is sourced and the intellectuals who are at its source is of the utmost importance in evaluating options. A problem in many countries in Africa, as noted by Herman Chitonge and Howard Stein, is the impact of neoclassical economic training on policy advisors who provide governments with little understanding on how to promote sustainable industrialization beyond the flawed logic of fiscal consolidation and austerity. Advisors who remain stuck in what I have described as the assumptions of the Princeton-influenced development model. A third source behind the debt crisis relates to the international financial architecture of the neoliberal model. It is an architecture that has developed a hierarchy of currencies that has been used to define a country's standing in the global order. Its usage has impeded the structural transformation of African economies while perpetuating the avenues of accumulation of wealth and power of elites, native and foreign, that have reproduced such striking global inequities. Again, quoting Howard Stein, African countries find themselves at the bottom of the hierarchy, with currencies that are unstable, with no international circulation, and are under constant pressure to accumulate dollars. Neoclassical economists tend to blame the lack of exchangeability on the lesser developed countries themselves, due to their poorly developed financial systems, weak institutional capacities, and macroeconomic mismanagement. In their view, the key to building up currency are the usual orthodox recommendations of fiscal and monetary responsibility, flexibility in exchange rates, deregulation to attract FDI, and the development of domestic bond and securities market. However, numerous studies have shown that countries that have pursued such policies have often been worse off economically, continue to be dependent on raw material exports, and are unable to break out of the cycle of debt and crisis. The ability to break out of a dysfunctional, imposed, or inherited system requires the development of a new set of assumptions, of constructs, ones that both understand and are willing to confront, if necessary, the sources of power that are perpetuating the system, and invite a discourse as to where and how that power can be contested. Without urgent action on debt relief, problems will persist into the 2030s. Pressures are greater now than those which prevailed during the Latin American debt crisis of 1982, which resulted in its day with the Brady Plan for Latin America, reducing debt service and assisting countries back to the capital markets, or the debt crisis of the 1990s, which prompted relief under the Heavily Indebted Poor Country Initiative, HIPIC. Current debt relief frameworks are simply not working. Among the suggestions made in the report by Debt Relief International, to which I've referred earlier, recommendations that I support include debt relief being available to countries of all income levels and regions and tailored to their needs. Debt relief should be provided in a manner that reduces debt service payments to less than 15% of budget revenues, and it should provide legal protection for debtors against holdouts and lawsuits in all major financial centers. All of this makes for good international economics, and I do congratulate the African Bank for its initiatives in this. Cancellation of debt service over the next 5 years would, for example, as Matthew Martin of Development Finance International has stated, fund the United Nations plan for a much-needed stimulus to aid the achievements of the Sustainable Development Goals. Reducing debt service to 15% of revenue for countries outside capital markets and having borrowing costs for those market-dependent countries would save sub-Saharan Africa at least $97 billion annually, money that could be available to fund social and environmental policies and measures to 2030. Other important proposals in Debt Relief International's report include credit enhancement measures to reduce borrowing costs in global, regional, and national markets, a 10-year debt service holiday for those accessing global markets less frequently, with debt cancellation for the worst affected and for those hit by climate-related natural disasters, and measures to cancel debt service for 3 years following disaster to aid the recovery and rebuild exercise. These proposals, in my view, are also relevant and worthy of support. In 2020, the G20 group of leading developed and developing countries launched the Common Framework, a scheme designed to speed up and simplify the debt relief process. However, progress has been much slower than was anticipated, reflecting the fact that much of the debt owed by developing countries is now to China and private bondholders. The report of Debt Relief International suggests that the Common Framework is falling, quote, way short of expectations in terms of timeliness, participation by creditors, and the scale of relief provided. Countries availing of the relief on offer would still be paying an average 48% of their budget revenue on service after relief, and consequently, fewer applying to join the process. In any ethically based consideration of development in Africa, we must address, too, the role that the global North has played in its limiting of options for helping the needs of contemporary African nations, in its contribution to suboptimal outcomes in terms of development policy. Climate finance grants from the global North for climate-hit countries are still grossly insufficient to support climate action and the necessary transitions required. Climate finance grants amount to just 5% of the global South public finance that is going to fossil fuels and industrial agriculture. As a result, global South renewable energy is receiving 40 times less public finance than the fossil fuel sector, while trillions of dollars in climate finance from the global North to the global South are necessary to address adequately the climate and development crisis we face. A recent ActionAid report deals with the corporate capture of public finance. It concludes that climate-destructive sectors are benefiting from subsidies amounting to an average of $677 billion in the global South every year. Money that could pay for schooling for all sub-Saharan African children 3.5 times over. These numbers illustrate a deeply worrying pattern about the state of the planet's finance flows and how corporate capture of public finance is actively undermining the needs of climate-vulnerable countries, as well as global climate commitments. Let us not forget that the global North is responsible for 92% of overshoot emissions. That is, the damage caused by climate breakdown. Yet the global North continues to retreat from its commitments to climate policy, biodiversity, ecology, to all that was promised for a re-engagement with Mother Nature. Since 2000, the growth of material use has outpaced GDP growth instead of dematerializing. The so-called developed world is rematerializing. The 2024 report of the Sustainable Development Goals informs us that for the first time this century, per capita GDP growth in half of the world's most vulnerable nations is slower than that of the advanced economies. That report also provides detailed evidence that demonstrate how our delivery on commitments made on sustainable development and climate change have been inadequate, how we are in fact regressing in so many areas of the United Nations 2030 agenda. As to food security, There are so many issues that must be urgently addressed then. We must tackle profound dysfunctions not sufficiently recognized regarding the delivery of food, where success in production is often defeated by costly transportation. The issues of ownership of seeds, fertilizers, tools of production, and their distribution, obstacles to the migration of science and technological innovations, questions as to the lending policies of the financial institutions. All of these issues cannot continue to be ignored and must be pushed to the fore in the discourse. There is an absence of authenticity in the reported discourse. We know, for example, that some of Europe's largest lenders assisted fossil fuel companies to raise in excess of €1 trillion from the global bond markets since the Paris Climate Agreement. Ending global hunger and preventing future famine requires that we face up to a range of sobering facts, facts which illustrate the dysfunctionality of our current food systems. How half of the world's over 8 billion population are defined as malnourished, how 2 billion people are experiencing undernutrition, how over 2.5 billion people consume low-quality diets or too much food, while 3 billion people could not afford a healthy diet, yet 1.6 billion tons of primary food production are wasted each year in what are described as developed countries, where obesity levels continue to spiral. Such facts point to the need not for minor adjustments or refinements to our current food production and distribution model, but I suggest for a radical paradigm shift. This requires us to tackle food speculation in crops, especially in wheat production. While recent volatile prices for crops are certainly a result of geopolitical movements as well as weather conditions, these variations have been exacerbated, as studies of recent famines show, by excessive financial speculation, a speculation that is also affecting transparency as to reserves. Food storage must be addressed. The overconcentration of wheat reserves, for example, among just a handful of nations must be tackled. China now holds over half of all wheat reserves globally. Excessive stockpiling is driving up international food prices, having devastating consequences for poor, food insecure nations. I welcome the recent Oxfam report, Food Wars, Conflict, Hunger and Globalization. I do so in particular for the manner in which it combines all the different elements that flow from hunger, including the connection between hunger, displacement, and conflict. The Oxfam report highlights a number of food and conflict disasters, including those in Sudan, Ethiopia, Nigeria, Somalia, Syria, Yemen, as well as in Gaza. Conflict is now the main driver of food insecurity, affecting 135 million people across 20 territories. The report rightly notes that the United Nations Security Council Resolution 2417, adopted in 2018, condemned intentional starvation as a war crime, yet notes that there is not yet accountabilities for such starvation crimes. Economic shocks were the second driver of food insecurity, affecting 75 million people, while climate change-related weather conditions accounted for food insecurity among a further 72 million people. Conflict and anticipation of conflict deflects interest and funding from the tasks of hunger alleviation or prevention. In their report, Trends in World Military Expenditure 2023, published in April, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute highlighted that world military expenditure increased for the 9th consecutive year in 2023 to a figure of $2,443 billion. This represents an annual increase of 6.8%, the steepest year-on-year increase since 2009, and the highest level the Institute has ever recorded. Dear friends, what a great failure this ratcheting up of armaments expenditure constitutes, especially at a time of existential crisis, at a time when people are dying of preventable hunger. War is not the natural condition of humanity. Cooperation is. When wars and conflicts become seemingly unending, humanity is always the loser. For example, the forgotten war in Sudan risks triggering the world's largest hunger crisis. An immediate ceasefire is needed to prevent a complete collapse in Sudan and further regional destabilization as millions flee into neighboring countries. As conflict rages, 18 million people face acute hunger. Of these, nearly 5 million are in emergency level of hunger. This is the highest number ever recorded during the harvest season. The food crisis in Gaza is exceptional too, for its source is entirely man-made. Conflict between Israel and Hamas, including Israel's siege of Gaza, has restricted humanitarian access across the Gaza Strip, and attacks have taken place on 8 convoys, while people are suffering from starvation. Gaza's entire population of 2.2 million people is classified as crisis, emergency, or catastrophe famine. The Center for Strategic and International Studies has told us that this represents the highest share of people facing high levels of acute food insecurity ever classified for any given area or country. Israel's escalation of the war into Lebanon, a country already suffering from food insecurity, owing to high debt and inflation, will result in yet more food insecurity, as the country endures a 5-year-long economic crisis, during which the national currency has lost 95% of its value. While it is inextricably linked to many of the planet's crises, including climate change, biodiversity loss, and conflict, the alleviation of global food insecurity would, on the other hand, have multiple co-benefits. Hunger is at the heart of the involuntary mass migrations which we now see, migration which leads to contested spaces. It is clear to me, and indeed to so many others, including scholars such as Professor Padraig Carmody, that we need a new departure with regard to food production models, one that deals with local realities, one that benefits from evidence from below, emerging from a new empirical and peer-reviewed use of social research, including a new anthropology guided by African scholars. Such a model offers a transparency and a security that a complete dependency on the market indicators of the international food value chain can never offer. To yield new models that can serve the diversity of our needs in sufficiency, in a sustainable way, requires a recognition of the flawed assumptions upon which our current food production models are based, assumptions which carry the weight of a checkered past. Ideas matter. How they're used matters, and they have a history. Modernization theory did not fall from the sky. From an early emphasis on the subjugation of nature came the imposed hegemonic idea of progress, followed indeed by modernization theory's evolutionist development theory, such as that outlined, and led by the Princeton studies of the 1960s, to which I have referred already, and that would go on to guide the practices of the World Bank. But ideas prove to be bad do not die. They can reappear in policy, often by stealth. For example, the relationship to land being reduced to a titled collateral for debt, as in the DeSoto model, is typical of such unspoken but repeated bad policy. Institutions carry ideological assumptions across borders and generations. As Howard Stein has put it, the shift of the World Bank and other donors towards titling was a natural outcome of its growing domination by neoclassical economics and its convergence with donor priorities and international capital. A similar shift in the domination of neoclassical economics in universities and government agencies on the continent of Africa has provided shared ideologies and constructs that have empowered these policies. May I ask with humility, what price have we paid for an uncritical adoption of ideologically laden, modernization-influenced development theory, with its inherent bias against indigenous practices and local cultural agency? The ongoing reliance, persistence in uncritical settings of such development theory has resulted in so many prominent, respected and well-funded actors in the development policy area averting their gaze from the basic structural issues that influence food insecurity. As to food, diet and nutrition itself, it is worth asking, how did so many in Africa become so dependent on so few staples, the production, distribution and consumption of over which they have so little control? How did the complex dependencies of global value chains emerge? And how are they sustained intergenerationally? Dear friends, change is possible. We can, for example, use science better. What a moral outrage it has become. What a great failure, with all the material resources available, given our boundless capacity for creativity and innovation, that the fruits of science and technology remain directed in so many parts of the world, not on the ending of global hunger or famine, or the promotion or preservation of peace, or indeed on reducing sources of inequality, but on the pursuit of ever more deadly technologies as instruments of war, and indeed that the results of science and technology are so often abused in the promotion through irresponsible advertising of a model of consumption and insatiable accumulation as the most desirable, even inevitable, version of a life of fulfillment. Possibilities for scientific cooperation with ethical purpose must be made better, sought out and embraced, including in the area of food security. It is through the sharing of scientific ideas that we may share the joy of scientific discovery that cooperation facilitates, even serendipitous discoveries, thus advancing the truly emancipatory potential of science for society and for all of life, ensuring that the fruits of science can contribute solutions to the great global social, economic, and ecological challenges we face on our planet. Seek to advance the possibilities of fulfillment for all that are there beyond the narrow provision of a source of wealth for any single individual or corporation. I stress the role of science as will be engaged in by young scholars, of the importance of taking into account responsible collaboration between the current and next generation, of their combined ingenuity in science, technology, and innovation, and of critiquing investments in the key areas of food and agriculture, of there being no borders to the application of ethics in science and technology. I do so with a firm belief that science can assist us in the delivery of a food-secure world. We now need the best ecological practices in agriculture, including agroecology, to become widespread. This is substantially different from mere adjustments to the productionist agronomy model or adjustment of a colonially imposed food system, one which has exacerbated food insecurity by creating overdependence on a small number of staples and an over-reliance on imported fertilizer, pesticide, and seeds. Putting this into practice requires that we must acquire a space for the discourse that is needed if we are to achieve the necessary transformation in policy and practice. We have some road to travel, on this objective. We need to give the time required for a serious review of our policies and the assumptions on which they are based. There's been such an emphasis, incorrectly in my view, and simplistically, on ever-increasing food production and yields, irrespective of structure, as an appropriate way for our growing world population. This has been a simplification that we must move beyond if we are to tackle the root causes of food insecurity. I believe that what is crucial is the addressing of the social structures in which such an increase in production and distribution of food is achieved. Where the food is produced, what is produced, and how, and with whose participation. Should we be considering and accept as sole outcome an industrial-style agriculture for the export market with an incidental outcome for Africa? This is the direction favoured by some following the African Food Summit in Senegal in 2023. I believe that we need to critique such a model for all of its consequences. My own view, which I have expressed in the papers I delivered in Rome and Dakar last year, is that we need to move beyond measures of output and intensification and instead build an approach that can focus on reforms that break food dependency, build on the privileging of smallholders of land in the introduction of change, allowing for the retention of African land in African ownership. The African Development Bank's Dakar II initiative, Feed Africa Food Sovereignty and Resilience, while ambitious in its scale, must not result in any one-size-fits-all approach with an emphasis on large-scale monocropping, formal seed systems and high-tech solutions, such as climate-smart agriculture, digital and precision agriculture, and chemical inputs. These methods may have a place, but they are out of reach for small-scale farmers due to their cost, risk to the environment, and threat to their autonomy and traditional practices. In this regard, I was grateful in preparing my paper to receive the views of the Alliance for Food Sovereignty in Africa, AFSA, representing as it does a coalition of 41 member networks across 50 countries. The Alliance has emerged as a critic of the Dakar II compacts, advocating instead a shift towards agroecology and food sovereignty, emphasizing the importance of sustainable agriculture and the empowerment of small-scale farmers. AFSA makes a convincing case for smallholders' land rights being protected from arbitrary dispossession of their lands for large-scale industrial agriculture projects, prioritizing the needs and voices of small-scale farmers will result, they suggest, and I agree, in the adoption of inclusive and participatory approaches, foster citizenship, and will contribute to a vibrant democracy. In this regard, the Food and Agriculture Organization's Asian experience is a powerful example, one that can, in collaboration with other agencies, be repeated in Africa. Efforts should be made to preserve agricultural biodiversity by supporting the maintenance of a rich variety of crops and breeds managed by small-scale food producers. This approach would also assist the resilience of smallholder farmers and the environmental sustainability upon which their livelihood depends. While the Dakar II initiative represents a significant investment in the future of African agriculture, its current trajectory does raise concerns as to inclusivity, environmental sustainability, and the long-term viability of small-scale farming. May I suggest that the model for Africa must be recalibrated to create an economy of sufficiency that will include an agroecology appropriately adjusted for demographic and cultural realities, in which the first objective is not merely in the satisfying of hunger, but to create nutritious produce, with exports from the surplus being a consideration after the first objective has been achieved. We must thus set out all of the endogenous and exogenous issues that require addressing, the latter including issues such as debt, inequitable trade, over-reliance on export crops, and unsustainable market conditions, and food dependency. By doing this, we have an opportunity to be part of the putting right of the consequences of decades of colonization of Africa, the exploitative extraction of resources from Africa for the benefit of others, in addition to the solving of one of the great moral outrages that we face, that of global hunger and food insecurity on a planet of plenty. The pursuit of resilience in food systems may help us also to see beyond disagreements and to begin resolving conflicts, enable us to recover, envisaging maybe a capacity for peace rather than the species failure that is war. The growing convergence of food systems and climate diplomacy should prompt us to overcome competing and wasteful silo approaches in multilateral diplomacy and to recommit to the United Nations 2030 agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals, our collective shared blueprint for a sustainable world and thriving humanity. Food insecurity has no respect for borders, and no country can overcome it alone. Our best strategy for lifting millions of people out of food insecurity, hunger, and famine is to act together with urgency and with solidarity. That is why multilateral institutions like the United Nations must lead on this agenda. It is clear, as the Secretary General has indicated on several occasions in recent times, that we must undertake work to reform our international architecture. This includes UN reform at the highest level, including the Security Council, which must be enlarged so that it is representative. We must as well have a revitalization of the General Assembly. If the United Nations, with its current structure, is unable to prevent war and conflict, unable to end famine and hunger, unable to manage migration, we must ask ourselves what needs to be done, and we must do it with great urgency. Make such changes to the structures and institutions of the UN so as to ensure that such fundamental goals, as well as the founding pillars of the United Nations all those years ago, can be delivered. Dear friends, food insecurity is a moral failing that stains us all. It is beyond time to achieve its end. We are challenged together to take meaningful steps to enable a fruitful re-engagement with nature, using the best of tools available to us, including notably anthropology, but all of the tools of social science. We are challenged to turn a corner on past failed models, often imposed without consensus and based on flawed assumptions. We are challenged instead to embark on a new beginning, one that is inclusive, life-affirming, and celebratory of diversity, one that can work in a variety of settings, including Africa, the continent of the young, upon which so much of our hope for the future rests, one that adequately responds to climate change and the needs of sustainability, one that offers the best prospects for avoiding unnecessary conflict and achieving peace within and between peoples. In the future, people may look back and celebrate what was an African initiative, what was chosen as the best path to a form of connection between economy, social justice, and ecology that might best serve humanity. The African initiative may be quoted in the future as the corrective to the modernization model for which not just scholars, but communities have been waiting. Such a model can save economics itself as a discipline by its redefinition and recovery as to moral purpose, restore a new equilibrium between economics, ethics, social justice, and ecology. We must endeavor together in our diverse world, seek to enable such an African initiative, and in doing so play our part in the construction of a cooperative, caring, and non-exploitative global civilization. We have an opportunity to make this century, the century of which a new African initiative is a part, of a shared human project in which we rid the planet once and for all of global hunger, one that will see a shared commitment to a global food secure family, one based on the firm foundations of respect for each nation's own institutions, traditions, experiences, and wisdoms, founded on a recognition of the solidarity and vulnerabilities that bind us together as humans, and an acknowledgement of the responsibility we share for our vulnerable planet and the fundamental dignity of all those who hold life on it. Movuika Live. May I thank you once again, the African Development Bank, Director General, President Adesina, for the honor which you have bestowed on me through your invitation to me to deliver this lecture. And may I thank all of you, Excellencies, distinguished guests present. May I thank you all for taking the time to listen. Movuika Live is Kalpanak Dontal, which translated is, my gratitude to you, and I wish you blessings for the future.
Well, President Higgins, I am sure that you can hear the resounding applause here in the room and the standing ovation that you are receiving. I will say that this is a first that I've seen anything like this during any of the Kofi Annan lecture series. Thank you very much, Your Excellency, for what truly has been a heartfelt, a passionate, profound, thought-provoking, powerful, and inspirational keynote. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, once again, the very distinguished keynote speaker of this 2024 Kofi Annan Eminent Speaker Lecture Series, the President of Ireland, His Excellency Michael Daniel Higgins. Could we give him a round of applause one more time? And on a personal note, President Higgins, I just want to bring to your attention the fact that my mother and my grandparents, like you, come from the most beautiful county in Ireland, County Clare. So I'm really honored. I need to do a DNA test. We possibly might be related, who knows? Once again, President Higgins, thank you very much for truly blessing us with a remarkable keynote. In less than 1 minute, permit me to highlight very rapidly 7 points from your remarks. You've noted the imposition of an unsustainable colonial and global North-imposed system that continues to cripple Africa's growth and its development aspirations. You've said never before have so many, on the one hand, had so little, and on the other hand, have so few, had so much, but without responsibility. The absence of global authenticity and honesty in dealing with some of the world's most intractable challenges. The diverse and contested debates about how to best achieve food security, and your insistence that food security must be achieved by globalization from below. And alarmingly, that Africa is dealing with its worst debt crisis in decades. This deplorable state of affairs you've mentioned includes a suffocating debt of 163 billion in 2024, rather of debt servicing in 2024, from what would have been 60 billion in 2010. An inequitable situation, you insist, that mops up available public finance and makes expenditure for social needs impossible. Food security, you said, has no borders and requires the collective efforts of many. But as we proceed, to keep in mind that bad ideas do not necessarily die. They simply reappear down the road through policies. Well, to explore these further, and I'm sure Dr. Adesina has taken copious notes as he tends to, I would like to invite Dr. Akinwumi Adesina here in Abidjan to join President Higgins in Dublin for what I tag a hybrid transatlantic fireside chat and an exchange that promises to deepen our understanding this afternoon and pave the way for a more structural African transformation today and beyond. With that being said, please give a warm welcome to Dr. Adesina as he joins President Higgins in a transatlantic hybrid fireside chat. You may sit over here. You may.
I want to be able to see.
Okay, that would be fine. And later on during the Q&A, I'll come on stage and join you. But Dr. Additioner, over to you. Thank you once again, President Higgins.
Well, Mr. President, let me thank you first and foremost. Yeah, you can move a little bit. For your very inspiring lecture. And thank you for dwelling on the fact that we live in a world in which there's so much, and yet few control most of the much that we have. And those that are at the bottom of the pyramid, which is basically the billions of people that are poor, don't have access to the basic things of life. So whether it's energy, whether it is food, whether it's access to finance, whether it's access to digital technologies and things that continue to divide us. So we live in a world in which it's a bipolar world. It's a highly unequal world. The rich keep getting richer, and the poor keep getting poorer. Now, I wanted to, you raised a very important thing about the issue around agriculture and your views about the kind of world that we should have for agriculture. And you posited about the need to have a radical shift in the agricultural systems, which I agree with, the need to have this shift. And you call them two competing approaches, so which is the industrial agriculture and the agency of the small farmers. And everything that you said about the need to have the views and perspectives of communities and farmers through anthropological approaches, I fully agree with. But let me tell you how I look at the issue of agriculture and the role of smallholder farmers. For so long, people thought that agriculture was only going to be only for smallholder farmers. Don't get me wrong, 80% of our farmers are smallholder farmers. And those smallholder farmers are the same ones that actually feed us with rice, and whether they are from India, whether they are from Philippines, or whether they are from China, or whether they are from Vietnam, you name it. So my view is we can't create a world in which it's a world that we want for smallholder farmers. We have to help smallholder farmers to engage in the world or the reality where they are in. And that world is one in which they need to have access to the same things that advanced countries have. Access to information, access to technology, because, you know, I remember much earlier in my career, I was involved in a debate where some folks were taking me on about what they call low-input sustainable agriculture. And I said, well, I have a big problem with low-input sustainable agriculture, because if one has a simple mathematical function, y is a function of x. If x goes towards 0, y asymptotically goes towards 0. And so anything called a low-input sustainable agriculture, as ideologically exciting as that may be for some people, I didn't like it because it means it will put African agriculture to be low input, low output, unable to feed itself, and Africa becoming simply a place in which people sell food. Now, when we look at the case of smallholder agriculture or smallholder farmers, what makes them different from the farmers of the world? I will posit a number of areas. First, is lack of support. Whether it's in the US, whether it's in Europe, whether it is in, you name it, farmers around the world are provided huge amounts of support. But when it comes to Africa, people say, well, you can't provide subsidy, you can't do this, you can't do that. I mean, why is that? Why is it good for the developed countries? Why is it bad for African farmers? So, in other words, the farmers that are producing cotton today in Burkina Faso are actually more efficient than those that are producing in other developed countries. The only difference is they are not competing against the farmers of those countries. They are competing against the treasuries of those countries because they provide them huge amount of subsidies which African farmers don't have. In other words, I would claim that the African farmers are like somebody you place on a rickety boat and you put on Atlantic Ocean in the world of global agriculture and say go survive without support. So my point is We need to have comprehensive support around smallholder farmers. Without it, they can't go anywhere. And those support must be on information, technology, access to market. They must also realize in other developed countries, institutional arrangements are developed to protect farmers, right? People always forget those institutional arrangements when it comes to Africa, and that's where I agree with you, Mr. President, on when you talked about the state, the role of the state. I fully agree with you. When the structural adjustment was done, and the pair of all the things that were supporting farmers and all of that, African farmers were left bare. No access to information, no access to extension, no R&D to support them, no infrastructure to support them. And at the same time, we can romanticize all we want about smallholder farmers. What is most important is that those smallholder farmers must be robustly supported in Africa the same way they are supported in developed countries. And the other thing that I wanted to also say with regards to this particular issue, which you raised in your incredible talk, was the impact of climate change. You know, and I think when we look at it, from Kenya to Zambia to Malawi to many of these countries, they're facing severe amounts of climate change. So I agree with you that the global climate change financing is not doing the job. Africa needs $277 billion a year in terms of climate adaptation. It's only getting $30 billion. So yes, we have to make sure that that is it. But just as in other developed countries, farmers in Africa must have crop insurance. The livestock farmers must have insurance. There must be disaster payments, such as it's done for farmers around the world, for our own farmers. In other words, what's good for the goose, it must also be good for the gander. The third one is what you raised importantly about the role of anthropology. And I fully agree with you. They need to understand local context, local knowledge, local institutions, and incorporate all of those things into what we do. Now, I was at the World Food Prize just last week with Dr. Fowler, who won the World Food Prize this year. And he has been working on what he called, that is President Biden's special envoy on food security. And they are working on something called VAX, which has to do with essentially the forgotten crops. So the fonioles of this world, the sorghum of this world, the cocoa yams that I ate when I was growing up and all that. On this, I agree with you that the normalization of global food systems based on a few crops has become a big problem, yes. And so you take, for example, Kenya, Malawi, and so on, all of those countries, Zimbabwe, all those countries used to have sorghum, millet, cocoyam, and so on, but now they were normalized in terms of wages based on maize. So the point I want to draw from your point here is that I agree we need to diversify better the food systems. We need crops that are resilient to climate. We need crops that are more nutritious, indigenous vegetables, and all of that. Now, in my experience, Mr. President, I also find that the issue about local knowledge sometimes is not often well incorporated into R&D. And I'll give you one example. And so when I was chief economist for the West Africa Rice Development Association, which is now called the Global Africa Rice Center, I was living here in Cote d'Ivoire in Bouaké, here, which is the second city here. And I had a student from Wisconsin University who later went on to become Minister of Agriculture for Liberia. And he did his PhD thesis under me. And we were looking at the time about, I'm actually interested in sociologists and anthropologists, just like you, but working with an economist, and we're looking at the role of farmer perceptions and agricultural technologies. And one thing we found was we went to a place called the Bompé River area in Sierra Leone, and we got germplasm and seed varieties of farmers. And when we got to this particular village, this particular woman farmer told us, she said, this particular rice variety is different because if you cook it, everybody in the village will keep coming back for more. This one, if you cook it, they eat it once, nobody comes back for more. And I ask, why is that? She explained that this one, when you eat it, it fills your stomach, right? So we went back, myself, to the lab, and we did an analysis of this indigenous knowledge that came from this farmer. And we found out that the amylose content of that variety that was filling the stomach was much higher. And that actually influenced the breeding program to develop more varieties that had higher amylose content, things you can put in your stomach and it stays. So I am saying that to say the anthropological perspective, the sociological perspectives are quite important in informing modern science and technology. But I wanted to correct something so that we don't both, probably, maybe we see it differently, but I just want to make sure that we're not at cross purposes here. The issue of the Dakar 2, and I agree all the areas you mentioned. But you see, African agriculture must modernize. African agriculture should not be different from other parts of the world. It must modernize, it must use more technology, it must be more efficient, it must be more competitive, and must be able to feed Africa. Of course, paying attention to biodiversity, paying attention to supporting smallholder farmers, who are the ones that we support. But we have to break the bounded constraints that those farmers have, which have to do with technology, information, markets, infrastructure, and connecting them to value chain. Mr. President, just to close on that, think of the following. When we don't industrialize agriculture in Africa, Africa becomes at the bottom of the value chain. And I've always said that the export of primary commodities, whether it's agricultural commodities, whether it is minerals, oil, gas, and metals, in their raw form, is the door to poverty. And the value addition is the gateway, highway to wealth. So I just want to say here, Mr. President, that I don't see that we are diverging on this particular issue. The Dakar 2 framework is focused largely on smallholder farmers. It's focused on, but however, removing the bounded constraints around them so that they can be more productive, efficient, competitive in feeding Africa. I just wanted to start with those for you. And also when it comes, I'm here in Côte d'Ivoire. Côte d'Ivoire produces the highest amount of cocoa in the world. But chocolates are made elsewhere, and they don't have a single grain of beans, of coffee beans or cocoa beans. So there is no doubt in my mind that we must be integrated into the global value chains, but we must be able to process and add value and move up on that global value chain. Otherwise, we'll be stuck and become poor. And of course, poverty cannot be a comparative advantage of Africa. Thank you, Mr. President.
I think it's been a very valuable presentation of what is an alternative to my model in a way. But there are many points upon which we are clearly in agreement. For example, on the importance of science and technology. I think that nearly everything I'm saying is about agency. It's about who owns what. I mean, when I began a long time ago looking at these issues in depth, there were a number of people who owned, if you like, the seeds that were used in Africa. There is now less than a quarter of those because they have amalgamated, they joined together. And then I also am very interested that's what I mean by agency, is what is being transferred. When I speak every year to young scientists in Ireland, and I urge them to make their original innovations available around the world rather than waiting for an innovation to be purchased by a multinational corporation and put into a black hole with no guarantee as to when it will ever arrive for any service to humanity. I would make a point that is very, very important. It is not a case, I think, in the long. First of all, I believe that there has been insufficient interest in African history. Africa's history did not begin at the moment of colonization. There were many movements of both cultural and many movements of an aesthetic kind, many forms of structure, many forms of jurisprudence and so forth that prevailed in interrelationship between clans. And in a way, it is a huge moment in the history of a country when it decides to innovate rather than to imitate. In relation to, yes, I do agree entirely. If you take the model, for example, state aid for agriculture, that is no disagreement with you there. This is the point that Howard Stein has made, is that we need a mixture of models with both state and private. But I would say this, the recent report on the common agricultural policy in Europe has shown that the great benefit of subsidies went to billionaires rather than to small farmers. The concentration in the policy on volume output rather than on the number of farmers has meant that the number of farmers, that is, those who actually touch the soil, those with knowledge of animals, those with information and so forth, they are shrinking. And in Europe, in many ways, what you've had, I suggest, you've had a bad effort at imitating United States-style agriculture on a continent that had an entirely different set of traditions in relation to rural life and agriculture. And we're coming to a point, and it's one I'm being very positive about, where we're going to have to assist directly farmers if we're going to have anybody in a relationship to the soils, in relationship to herd management. And we need all of that because this is a wisdom we need for sustainability, for farmers looking after the land, looking after animals and so forth. So there are many things not to imitate in the European model. And of course, there has been for years many things not to imitate in relation to what had been United States agriculture at an incredibly large scale. And when I do think, I actually I kept thinking when I, back to year 2007, something, you reminded me of something. In that year, the president of Malawi, President Mutharika, in fact, found himself in conflict with most of the donors who were supplying money to Africa, and indeed with the international agencies. It was at that stage, what did he do? He had said, the point I had in my own lecture, he said, we must get beyond humanitarian effort, and he asked for a small proportion of the humanitarian volume to be spent so as to ensure that people wouldn't have to suffer from famine again. He was roundly condemned by the international. In fact, I have to tell you, Professor, that I mentioned, Glendenning and Jeffrey Sachs were among those who supported him. And he said, I think at a meeting in 2007, President Mutharika said, they want me to get down on my knees and ask for food. I say I want, in fact, actually to produce food and for what we need and export food and so forth. And what was very interesting was the battle in 2007 as to whether, in fact, by his giving his vouchers for fertilizers and seeds and so forth, it was an ideological opposition, completely ideological opposition. And the World Bank, in fact, and those who worked in it were carrying all of the assumptions that I mentioned. You and I don't differ that much because, in fact, what you are doing is we both want to privilege, if you like, a modern, competent African agriculture. Where I'm putting the emphasis, however, in many cases, is that this is the way I see it. I put myself back in the family of an African family, in which it's at the first interest, and which largely falls very much on women too, because of the gender adjustments we have to do yet. But you're seeking food. Then after that, there is a question in relation to that, how food is prepared and all of the energy implications of all of that. All of that can, in fact, I've seen it when I visited myself in relation to people using solar energy in relation to it, and African women doing so. All of this is possible. But the issue that we can't simply say, but remember, I say to, while I have this audience, to say to them, what is moral about one or two individuals controlling so much without accountability. The whole history that we've had is that our models of struggling to accountability, the growing realm of unaccountability, is the greatest single threat to all of us. It's a threat to democracy, when in fact, actually, in many cases, it was a struggle to give public responsibility and accountability in relation to broadcasting. We did it. That is gone. In relation to print, in relation to the flow of money. I simply do not regard any of these exploitative models as a reality that must not be challenged. But I think very, very much of the different places of things. I think, for example, and they know more than when I said it, when I see behind a wire youngsters holding out their empty bowls of food in Gaza and elsewhere, I'm shocked at all of this. And then when I move to the boardrooms of those who are drawing dividends from their shares in the armaments industry, they should be covered in shame. It is a shame. And there is nothing in terms of the history. I'm at whatever stage I am at my life about it. But the idea that one or two individuals will claim I am the richest person in the world, but I have no sensibility for equality. In fact, I believe you should treat people like commodities, push them around and so forth. I'm against that. But what's much more interesting to me in our conversation today, so are most Africans. Africans look at the fun, when I look back at what I studied in before, I look at the people who looked at the dog star Sirius, and they construct a cosmology. In Africa, some of the most wonderful things have been constructed long before colonization. When I say this isn't the time to take, here's the choice, with all of these young people available, to in fact actually draw on a long, long past before the exploitation and before all of these, but also envisaging the future. I'm perfectly happy, as President of Ireland, I encourage every year young scientists, go to where you are needed. I think, for example, a brilliant Irish Nobel Prize winner who in fact actually offset that I want my work to be available to everyone so that it had an effect on river blindness. That's what we want.
And that's great, President.
We cannot go on forever.
Yes.
The United Nations, I've been describing how it has been made weak. It has been made weak by those who abuse power.
Yeah.
And it just has to be said like that. The United Nations of the future must be one that reflects the vulnerabilities, the possibilities, the imagination, and the wonder of all of the world, without racism and without anything.
Absolutely, Mr. President.
But I do see, I take your point. I'm not a Luddite.
You are so right, Mr. President.
I agree with entirely one of agency.
If I may just come in.
I criticise the DeSoto model because of what it robbed from people in Central America. It's a failed model.
Yes.
And in my view, it has no place in Africa. I've seen that, by the way, for empirically, it surfaces, I think, in the Lesotho model. I looked at it, where it has absolutely, not only is it not useful there, it's just simply
Mr. President, if I may just come in on this issue, you and I agree on the need to have more supported state. Because if we say we want to build the globalization from the bottom, that globalization will start by supporting those that are at the bottom. And the example that you gave about Malawi is a very, very instructive one. In fact, for your information, I was actually involved in that work together with Jeffrey Sachs and President of the time, Mutarika. I remember we went to see President Mutarika, and his Minister of Finance was a man called Mr. Gondwe. It's a big man. He used to be acting president of the African Development Bank. I was at that time at the Rockefeller Foundation. And I made the case that smallholder farmers that we talk about, because I don't try to romanticize about things, I'm a practical person. When it comes to the issue of Malawi, Malawi has a very high level of population density. And land being the major issue. Of course, if land is the major constraint, as an economist, I know I have to optimize around land. So which means I have to raise productivity vertically and not expand production horizontally, as you rightly said. So we went over there, and we developed what's called the Malawi Agricultural Input Support Program. And when we presented that to prevent subsidies to farmers, it was amazing. The donors, some of the donors, they just picked their files and walked out of the meeting. And I remember Godway, God bless his soul, he's passed away now. He kind of moved back on his chair like this, and he said, "They are gone now, let's do it." And that was how we provided support for smallholder farmers of Zimbabwe, of Malawi. They produced, Mr. President, in a year, more food than they've ever produced, and they exported 400,000 metric tons of food to Zimbabwe, right? So that tells me that African farmers can be more efficient, technically, economically, but they badly need support. Now, they're not different from any farmer around the world if they get the support. I want to also comment on something that you raised, which has to do with the issue of the global financial architecture. And you're absolutely right, that architecture is not serving the needs of Africa well. In many ways. First is if you take a look at it in terms of access to climate finance that you said, Africa is getting about 3% of global climate finance, and it needs a lot more. And secondly is if you take a look at what has happened after COVID-19, and you have all these expenditures by developed countries, and developed countries spend well over almost 19% of their GDP, in $19 trillion or more in stimulus packages. Africa spent $83 billion, about 4.5%. And so that created a divergence post-COVID that we currently have. And if one also takes a look at the conditional financing system that we face, which is the special drawing rights, and you and I were talking about that on the phone call before this thing, the special drawing rights were done, $650 billion were given to special drawing rights. Africa got $33 billion, 4.5% of that. But yet, those that actually don't need that, one that actually got it. It's good that that reallocation has been done to IMF through this Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust and also the Resilience Trust. But here is the good part, Mr. President. It's that the African Development Bank led the work together with the Inter-American Development Bank to say how can the special drawing rights be rechanneled through the multilateral development banks like ourselves. And that model will allow us to leverage by 8 times the special drawing rights. So $1 becomes $8, just like that. And this is the way in which we are going to be able to use the firing power of the multilateral development banks to do that. And I think this is very important to dealing with that. And lastly is the issue of debt. I agree with you, Mr. President, on what you said about debt. There is no way, it doesn't matter whether you like mountain climbing or not, you cannot run up a hill with a pack of sand on your back. And I think the debt situation desires that we deal with that. But in dealing with it, there are multiple ways. There's, of course, the G20 Common Framework, as you said, is very slow. It's worked, but it needs to be faster. There needs to be also debt forgiveness for countries that are badly indebted. There's also the need to have climate resilient debt clauses so that when there are challenges, as you rightly said, countries don't have to pay. We're working on that. World Bank also and others are working on that. But also need to have catastrophic, we have to be able to insure countries against catastrophic events. And so if we don't insure countries and they have those kind of problems, we are going to have issues. So I do think that we need to work assiduously to make sure that the debt architecture is done, but the only way we can do that is to increase concessional financing available for countries. Because as you rightly said, most of them are going to the capital markets. We need to increase that. And that's why the 2 instruments to do that is the African Development Fund, for which I thank you for your support to that. We are in our 17th replenishment. I would like to ask for yours and others' great support for that. We've set a target of $25 billion that we want to raise. But not only for us, the World Bank, I was with Ajay Banga, and they also are doing their work for IDA 21, so they also require support. But my point is this: we cannot turn around the situation we have in the world today if concessional financing continues to decline at a time when countries cannot access capital markets and they have liquidity challenges and so on. And just to close, because we're too, on one particular issue, is the issue that has to do with agroecology, which is, you are very passionate about agroecology. Mr. President, I fully agree about the need to have more sustainable agricultural systems, to use indigenous knowledge, but indigenous knowledge is not enough. We have to complement and that with modern science and technology so that our farmers have access to the best of tools that they need to break the productivity barrier that they have. And when they have it, Mr. President, they do wonders. Ethiopia, where your wife worked many, many years ago, we provided them with high-yielding varieties, drought-tolerant varieties of wheat. In 2008, Mr. President, they cultivated 5,000 hectares. Smallholder farmers, all in lowland irrigated areas of Ethiopia. Last year, they cultivated 1.2 million hectares. And Ethiopia became self-sufficient in wheat in 4 years, all done by smallholder farmers. So the point I want to make is African smallholder farmers, when properly supported, they will be more competitive than any other farmer in the world. We just have to end this issue of not supporting them comprehensively. And I think that's what I take away from our conversation today, that we live in a world in which we need to be more equitable. We need to make sure that it's not just a war for the few. We need to make sure that it's not just profit maximization, but also equity in the way in which wealth is distributed. But let's also make sure that global institutions work for those at the bottom, whether it's Africa needing to be at the United Nations Security Council, whether it's African farmers needing support, or Africa needing to also have debt relief so it can actually continue to participate actively in global development. Mr. President, let me thank you very, very much for a very stimulating lecture. Thank you very much for using your wide experiences in agroecology and anthropology to inform our thinking. I think it's a continued conversation. I love you very much because for all of what you do. I also love you because you went to Indiana University. And so when I come to see you in Ireland, maybe you and I can talk about basketball. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you so very much.
And President Higgins, if you could just hold on for a moment. And Dr. Adesina, if you could just also hold on for a moment. This has been a really fascinating and very robust fireside chat where both of you have made very strong statements, taken very strong positions, again, trying to achieve the very same objective. So I want to play the angel's advocate as we bring this session to a close. President Higgins, you've talked about the bottom-up approach, and I was just wondering, which specific examples have you seen in Africa where this has worked in terms of food security and structural transformation? And are there any ways in which Ireland can help support Africa's initiatives in this regard? And I'm going to end with Dr. Adesina and say, as you've listened to some of the concerns and some of the issues that President Higgins has raised, looking at three of your initiatives, the Feed Africa Summit, the Feed Africa Initiative, TAT, which is technologies, or African technologies for Africa's transformation. It's pretty much a mouthful. I'll just stick with TAT for now, as well as special agro-processing zones. These are all designed to drive productivity, but also improve the lives of millions of African farmers. So as we bring this session to a close, how do we bring about convergence in our views, in our perspectives, our models and our approaches to ensure that at the end of the day, development does take place, but development that impacts the lives of the majority of Africans? I'm going to start with Dr. Adesina first, and then, no, actually, let me start with President Higgins first, and then I'll hand over to Dr. Adesina. So, President Higgins, over to you.
I think that we already have had an example upon which Dr. Adesina and I agree, and that is very much the 2007 example from Malawi. That posed a direct question. Why is it that, and Ireland, I think, is among the countries that is per capita the largest in responding to disasters. But why is it globally that people want not to move beyond humanitarian assistance? And that issue was provoked in the 2007 issue in relation to the president of Malawi, who saw that you needed, in fact, to create capacity. There is this, I would say, which is very, very interesting. In relation to what Ireland might contribute as well, I think it is very good that Ireland is supporting the African Development Bank and particularly the development initiatives. And I support that, and I hope it even strengthens. But the concept of cooperation, I've looked at different models, for example, of Ujamaa, Tanzania, and others, which was a state model and the rest of it. If you ask me about looking back at the history of Irish agriculture, I think that we didn't make sufficient use of cooperation. We began in agriculture with very successful use of the cooperative model. But in fact, actually, the imbalance in relation to benefits from the European Union and whatever, it was when we went away from that and moved, in fact, to corporate structures that huge imbalances. The exact same is true in the United Kingdom. It's true everywhere where we, in fact, actually people who have, in fact, been taking gains from the common agricultural policy. So there is, in fact, in African cultures in so many diverse ways of using cooperation. And it is possible. That is why if you give agency to such cooperatives, that is curiously, I think, what the president of Malawi had in mind in 2007. It isn't a case of an either or, but I do think as well is that quite separate from issues of Africa and agriculture itself, the international system is in a huge amount, a moment of flux. I think it would be disastrous for literally everybody on the planet if we have totally unnecessary trade wars. It also, in many, many cases, we have to see. But I go back to my word that is unfashionable, and that is the word sufficiency. I actually, when the long history of countries and civilizations, where in fact people made sufficiency their primary aim before you disposed of the surplus, you got civilizations of simplicity, but also of extraordinary value in other ways. I see all of that as in the future of Africa. So I don't think we have to choose, I think, between it isn't a case of it isn't the case only of you take that. I'm not arguing against science at all. It is that science, but science be the agency for it be with Africans rather than be external. The same thing, seeds, implements, and so forth. And I'm totally in agreement with those who are, let's say, in relation to the research in seeds. I'm familiar with what research on rice, for example, achieved in relation to Asia. But you can do the same thing, but also you don't have to exclude indigenous or traditional forms of knowledge in relation to combination and choice of crops.
Thank you very much, President Higgins. The operative words there are sufficiency as well as agency for millions of African farmers. Thank you very much. And last word to President Additioner.
Yeah,
your thoughts.
Mr. President, I think we pretty much aligned in the sense that if you need a train, it moves on two tracks. And you need science and technology. You also have to make sure that the agency issue of the knowledge of farmers are actually used as part of that, and that we preserve biodiversity, all of that, and focus a lot on the those at the bottom, which is for smallholder farmers. Just three things I want to say. If you take, for example, what we're doing in terms of farmers adjusting to drought that you have today, in Kenya, in Zambia, in Malawi, Zimbabwe, like in 2018 or 19, when there was a very severe drought. Remember that time, and there were all these problems. What we actually did at African Development Bank was to provide smallholder farmers through what we called TAT, which is the Technologies for African Agricultural Transformation, access to water-efficient maize. These are not GMOs. These are just good science that actually were able to get maize varieties that are resistant and tolerant to drought. We provided that to about 3.8 million households, which probably supported so many, about almost 28 or 30 million farmers, people directly that escaped the drought. If you look at what happened again in the case of rice, which you just mentioned,
Yes.
we have today rice technologies that are allowing farmers to get a good yield, great yield. The Secretary of State Blinken for the United States came here to Abidjan to see the work of Africa Rice that we are supporting, and he was blown away by this. We provided those varieties to 3.2 million households that actually helped them. Now, the point that I wanted just to make on this is that we need to close a productivity gap between African farmers and the rest of the farmers in the world. We also have to make sure that we create a resilience buffer for our farmers in the face of climate change, that they are going to be able to cope and be able to produce in the face of climate change. And third is that we need comprehensive support systems of infrastructure around them. You mentioned in your lecture about the whole issue of storage technologies. Today, Mr. President, if you go to African countries, you find the companies that are processing food, they are located in the urban areas, close to the port. Well, where are the farms there? There aren't farms next to the port. All they do is that they bring in semi-finished products, they process that, and they send that inside, disconnected with the farmers, disconnected from providing opportunities for those smallholder farmers. And that's why the African Development Bank is rolling out what we call special agro-industrial processing zones that are actually providing the kind of infrastructure they need. So power, water, roads, irrigation, storage, logistics systems, so that the farmers can be able to get access to to markets. I think this is very, very important. At the end of the day, I believe very strongly that we must modernize African agriculture. We must make it more productive, more efficient, more competitive. Agriculture must move away from being a way of life. Agriculture is a business. Every single smallholder farmer I see out there is a business person that needs information, technology, that needs access to finance, that wants to connect. I come from my father, grandfather were farmers. And I know that poverty is not pretty. And the way to actually do it is to make their source of livelihood a source of wealth. And the way to do that is to make agriculture a business that works for them. And Africa, which has 65% of all the uncultivated arable land left in the world, has a responsibility, a duty, a global obligation to feed in the world 9.5 billion people in the next 10 years or so. It can only do that by doing all the things that you talked to us today and what I also shared, making sure that Africa gets more financing. We reduce the issue of debt. We ensure there's equitable development. We ensure that our farmers are the center of public policy. We give them comprehensive support. And we make sure that those farmers, agriculture works for them as a source of wealth, not a way of managing poverty. That's all I would say.
Thank you very much, Dr. Adeshina. And I'd like to say a very big thank you to you both. President Higgins joining us from Dublin this afternoon. Dr. Adeshina here in Abidjan. We're truly grateful to the both of you for your passion, your shared passion, your wisdom, the insights that you've provided, the vision that you share, as well as the future that you perceive if we do get things right. We're indebted to you both, and we want to thank you, President Higgins, for being our keynote speaker today during this 2024 Kofi Annan Eminent Speaker Lecture Series. Thank you so much. Again, ladies and gentlemen, to President Higgins in Dublin, to Dr. Additioner here in our studio in Abidjan. Thank you so much. This has really been a very riveting, inspirational, energetic, and robust session with the both of you. At this point, we're going to do a very quick transition. Don't go away, President Higgins. As a token of our gratitude, I gather that the bank has a presentation that they're going to make, and it will be sent to you expeditiously in Ireland over the next few days. I'm going to hand over to President Additioner to make that presentation on behalf of the African Development Bank. We'll close with a few announcements after that and then proceed with the rest of the program. Dr. Additioner, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Victor. Mr. President, this is an area where I actually think technology can help us. Maybe one day we'll be able to project this and give it to you directly over there. Who knows? But this is a plaque from the African Development Bank in appreciation and recognition for an outstanding lecture delivered on the 7th of November 2024, Achieving Food Security Through Globalization from Below, Issues for Structural Transformation, Inclusive Economy and Sustainable Development in Africa, presented to His Excellency Michael D. Higgins, President of Ireland. Mr. President, thank you once again on behalf of myself, on behalf of our board of directors, on behalf of the senior management and staff of the bank, and on behalf of the people of Africa that you support so much from your country and from your own personal life. Thank you very much, and please give our best wishes and our love to your very dear wife, Mrs. Higgins. Thank you very much, and thank you very much. God bless you, sir.
And just before, thank you very much, Dr. Additioner, and just before you leave, President Higgins, a very quick announcement. There will be a closing cocktail for members of the diplomatic community, board members, and senior members of staff. That will be the first floor, the parenthesis room. And for other participants, there'll be a cocktail on the ground floor, just by where the flags are. And immediately following, we will have a photograph opportunity. I'm just trying to figure out how we can do this. I'd like to invite onto the platform, actually onto the platform right now, members of the board, as well as the chief economist. And I'm just going to try and figure out something. If you could join us on the platform very quickly, I'm going to ask that you juxtapose the picture right over here, and that way we can grab a shot of you with President Higgins, and then I'll formally bring this session to a close.
Victor, it's better, it's bigger here.
Okay, right over here. Then it's going to be right, but the problem there, no. The problem there is that we don't have cameras over there. So ECVP, no, let's do it right over here. We can't do it over there. We're going to do it right over here.
Okay, all right.
Just from a video presentation, we're going to flag. Actually, we can try it both ways.
As long as we don't cover the president.
That's okay. Now, if you could just flank, that, that'd be great. And then when we're done with that, we'll do another photo shoot just right over here, just that we get it right, and then we'll bring this session to a close. Let us make sure that the President is in the middle. And I'm also going to ask, as the members of the board take their seats, that members of the diplomatic community who are here also join Dr. Additioner on the platform. Members of the diplomatic community, if you're still here with us. Going in 5, 4, 3, 2, and okay, we do have members of the diplomatic community here. Kindly join Dr. Additioner if we could flank. That would be great.
They have to have a full screen of the president. Okay, all right.
There we go. So President Higgins, you're right there in the middle, and you're looking great. Thank you very much. And I'm going to ask And it won't be an overkill, but just one last photograph right over here at a lower level with Dr. Adishna and the chief economist. Just right over here from a photographic perspective. If we could have the photographers right over here. Very quickly, flanking the screen on the floor. There we go. So what we're doing here, President Higgins, we've got a lower screen that's much lower than the one that we just took photographs of. And you're looking wonderful as usual. And we're just about to take a 3-shot with you. Chief Economist, could you just move in a little bit more? There we go, nicely flanked. Excellent. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Most appreciated. On that note, we formally bring this session to a close. My name is Victor Oladokun. It's really been an honor, and I want to thank the Chief Economist and his team for doing a fantastic job facilitating this event. I know a lot of work has gone on behind the scenes to make this possible. It's been an honor moderating and emceeing this session. President Higgins, we look forward to seeing much more of you in the future, and once again we thank you for the tremendous work that you do and for the inspiration that you are, not just to Ireland, but to us in Africa and the rest of the world. On this note, I'll hand over to Dr. Adishna for any closing. Okay, Dr. Adishna says we're done. So again, following the announcements earlier, we thank you all. President Higgins, much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.